everyone. So now I'd like to move on to the even more complex approaches for design and analysis that involve your ANOVA. So as I mentioned earlier, one-way ANOVA is the simplest kind of ANOVA, which might seem ridiculous because it might be the most complex computation we've done thus far. So I do want to introduce you to the factorial approach for ANOVA, where basically you can have more than one independent variable current under contemplation at the same time. So obviously this gets a little bit more complex. The math for factorial ANOVA is far more complex than that for the one-way ANOVA. So I actually elected to not cover any hand calculations for your factorial ANOVAs. I really just focus on the design and how you would do the analysis in SPSS. So even though this is a slightly more advanced topic, there's not going to actually be any intense mathematical calculations that you have to do. You just need to follow along conceptually and be able to apply what you know about factorial design and ANOVA to interpreting your SPSS output. So let's get started. I'm going to talk first about factorial design, so how you can actually structure your slightly more complex research approaches, and then I'm going to talk about your factorial ANOVA, so how you'd actually analyze the data for your factorial design. So I started the previous lecture talking about your one-way ANOVA. A one-way ANOVA works when you have what we refer to as a one-way design. This is going to be any time you have a single independent variable currently under contemplation. As we've learned, if you've got a single independent variable with two levels, you do your t-test. If you have three or more levels within your single independent variable, that's when you would do your analysis of variance. A lot of the times, though, we're interested in how more complex relationships and interactions between variables lead to interesting outcomes. We learned about moderation when we talked about more complicated correlational design. This is going to be the group differences equivalent, but it's still going to be moderation. So a factorial design is going to be any time you have an experimental design with more than one independent variable. A factor refers to a single independent variable, and a factorial design will refer to however many IVs are present within the experimental design. So a two-way factorial design will be a factorial design with two IVs within it. You can have as many independent variables being evaluated simultaneously as you want or as you need to properly capture the relationship between your variables. Now, this can get out of control pretty fast. The number of independent variables you have will exponentially make a more complicated research design. So it's not necessarily that we want to have the most complex designs imaginable. It's just that we want to, as accurately as possible, capture slightly more complex relationships between variables. So we'll think through what two-way designs look like and what three-way designs look like, and you're really just going to want to understand how these factorial designs are structured and how they work. So in order to have a shorthand to describe your various factorial designs, there is a notation system that we use that gives us the information about the number of factors in our design, so how many IVs we have, and the number of levels within each factor. As I mentioned, the distinction between a t-test and an ANOVA has to do with the number of conditions or groups within the independent variable. If you have a single IV with two levels, then you can use a t-test. But anything more complex than that, you would want to use an ANOVA. So since there's various levels to which your factorial designs can be complicated, this factorial notation is going to be a shorthand system where you can use a numerical notation to indicate how many factors you have in your design and the number of levels or conditions within each of your factors. So whenever you read about factorial design ANOVAs, you're going to see this basic setup for the notation, a blank by blank factorial design. So for example, a 2 by 2 will be notated as that 2x2. We say 2 by 2 design. So what that 2 by 2 tells you about the factorial design is that you have two factors or independent variables. each containing two conditions or levels within the factors. So how did I read that from the 2 by 2? There are two critical things to look for when you're reading and interpreting your factorial notation. One is counterintuitively the number of the numbers, okay? That first value in the notation represents an IV, and the second value represents there being a second IV. So counting the number of numbers tells you how many IVs there are. That is a separate issue from what the number actually is. So the fact that it's a 2 by 2, it's the fact that there's two numbers telling you that there's two IVs, but the 2 itself is communicating something about the factor it's representing. So the actual value of the number is what tells you how many levels there are within the factor standing in for that IV. Now, this might be confusing at first, but I'm going to show you lots of different examples of the various notations and describe what those different notations mean. But you're going to see 2 by 2 a lot because this is as basic a factorial design as there is. Two IVs with two levels per IV, that's as basic as a factorial design can be, but I'll show you slightly more complex notations because only by seeing the different notations can you start to get a handle on how you read and interpret them. So some more terminology to get through. Within our factorial design, we have a name for all of the combinations of conditions. We refer to all the combinations of conditions as a cell. So this is going to be a specific condition within your factorial design. To know the total number of conditions overall throughout your experimental design, you just need to multiply the numbers from each of your levels. So a 2 by 2 design actually contains 4 overall conditions. Since there's 2 levels within IV2, they need to be fully combined with the 2 levels from your second IV, thus leading to 4 cells overall. So I'm going to show you examples of these again because it's not until you see different examples of different factorial designs that you start to get a handle on what it actually means. Okay, so let's say I'm interested in how being insulted affects aggression when someone has been consuming alcohol. What this research question basically is interested in is whether or not alcohol and insult interact to influence aggression. This is again a type of moderation. This would be the kind of research question that might be applicable to a factorial design. I'm interested in how alcohol and insult combine to do something interesting or different to aggression that alcohol and insult separately might not do. So what you would need to do in creating your experimental design is conduct a study in which you manipulate or actively change something about both of your independent variables. So insult is one of my IVs, alcohol is another. Aggression in this context is going to be my DV or dependent variable. So this is what my 2 by 2 design would look like. I need to create my 2 levels for my first IV, my insult condition, and 2 levels for my alcohol IV. So a basic 2 by 2 that was interested in manipulating insult and alcohol, right? Think about what it would entail to manipulate those two factors. For the alcohol condition, or IV, I need to create people who receive alcohol and people that don't receive alcohol. So those are my 2 levels within the alcohol IV. I do the same thing for insults. For some of my participants, they will not receive any insult whatsoever. Another group will be insulted. What I need to do to properly pull off this factorial design is I need to create all possible combinations of the levels within both my IVs. So this is why a 2 by 2 breaks down into 4 cells. I will have participants who fall into each of these 4 quadrants. The best research design will have me randomly assigning people to one of these 4 conditions. So a quarter of my participants will both receive an insult and receive alcohol on that top left quadrant. That bottom right quadrant represents people that neither were insulted nor drank alcohol. And then that other diagonal gives me the other possible combinations, people who were insulted but received no alcohol, and people who received alcohol but no insult. This is what I mean by a full combination of my factors. And that's why a 2 by 2 breaks down into 4 overall total possible conditions, i.e., cells. So maybe my prediction and the reason why I want to do a 2 by 2 factorial design in the context of this research question is maybe I predict that being insulted will increase aggression, but especially so when someone has consumed alcohol. So again, think about why this is another example of moderation. It's a different way that moderation can be evaluated using group differences as opposed to correlations, but it is moderation nonetheless, because the idea is that two factors come together to predict the outcome of your dependent variable. So, as with the one way, you need to compare all your conditions to figure out whether or not the dependent variable is affected by your independent variables. But in this case, you just now have more different groups to evaluate, right? You have a mean for the insult and alcohol group, and for the no insult and the no alcohol group, and the no insult alcohol, and the insult no alcohol. Okay, so you have 4 different group means to contend with. The idea of moderation is whether or not one of those cells in particular has a mean that's different from the other ones, because that would indicate the potential presence of a moderation. Other things to take note of when looking at this visual is that I have means that are collapsed across conditions. What I mean is that in addition to showing you the 4 means of the 4 cells, I also have means collapsed. So, for example, if you look across that top row where I have the people who were insulted, right, some of the insulted people had alcohol and some of them didn't, right? The insult alcohol was a mean of 6, insult alcohol was a mean of 3. You additionally can get the mean of insult itself, not breaking it down by alcohol versus non. So the overall mean for all the insulted individuals, regardless of alcohol condition, was 4.5. You're going to want to have those collapsed means as well, because these are going to give you different bits of information above and beyond what those 4 cell means tell you as well. This is going to allow you to investigate other questions besides that of the moderation. It's going to essentially let you figure out whether or not there is an effect of insult before you even take alcohol into account. And that's going to be useful information as well. Okay, so this main effect I just referred to, this is when you want to know the differences just looking at a single IV, regardless of the second IV. So if I think that insult has an effect on aggression before alcohol even has its exacerbating effect, that's interesting information as well. So in the context of our factorial designs, we do evaluate our main effects as well. This you can do by just looking at the insult versus no insult means. So this just adds to our knowledge of just how aggression comes to be. By understanding main effects as well as moderations, we get a more holistic image of just what leads to aggression. So the main effect is going to be distinct from the interaction, which in this case is a moderation, right? When the effect of one variable on the DV is dependent on or is changed by levels of a subsequent independent variable, right? So there might be a main effect of insult whereby insult by itself increases aggression, but what if bringing alcohol into the mix exacerbates that relationship? That would mean that alcohol moderated the effect of insult and aggression. And again, having a full idea of the main effects and the interactions paints the whole picture of how all these variables are related. So you would break down your data and visualize it like this. This is a little bit different from when we used to visualize our moderation using correlation, but it's depicting a moderation nonetheless. So if you were to depict your means from all 4 of your cells, those hypothetical means would look something like this. And this drives the point home of the main effects and the interactions, right? You can tell by the bars color coded by insult and no insult, and the alcohol versus no alcohol depicted there on the x axis. You can tell a few things by eyeballing the data. You can tell because both of the orange bars are higher. You can tell that insult by itself increases the level of aggression before alcohol is even considered. But you can see that that one bar representing the insulted people who drank was by far the highest. This is a quick and easy way to try and see that data that looks like this might be indicating a moderation. A quick and easy indication that moderation might be present in data that looks like this is when one of those bars looks very different from all the others, because that would tell you that a single cell is different from all the others. And that's a quick and dirty tip that you can use to figure out whether or not a data visualization like this indicates moderation may be present. So again, the main effect is evaluated by collapsing the differences between conditions such that you have means reflecting just the effect of one of the IVs regardless of the second IV. So if I just had one bar for the insult mean versus the no insult mean, no longer broken down by alcohol. If it was the case that the insult, regardless of alcohol, and the no insult were different before alcohol was taken into account, that again would be an indication that a main effect was present. The interaction, though, can be the result, or will be the result, of the level of the DV hinging on the relationship between both of your IVs. So again, as you can see, the effect of insult on aggression is exacerbated by alcohol. As we discussed when we were talking about moderation a month ago, using words like the relationship between two variables was exacerbated or diminished when taking into account the moderator. That would be a statement reflecting the potential presence of moderation. Okay, so that was all a basic 2x2 design. Again, 2x2 has two independent variables, each containing two levels. But to make sure you understand how factorial notation works, I want to make sure to show you some slightly more complex designs, and again, walk you through what they might look like. So let's take our 2x2 and turn it into a 2x3, because I don't know about you, but I'm ready to party. Why not try and take a slightly more nuanced or sophisticated look at different levels of alcohol? Now, if any of you have ever consumed alcohol, think about it. Is it the case that there's a dichotomous effect of alcohol whereby there's no alcohol consumption and then you have a single drink and all of a sudden you're flying off the handle? Does alcohol work like that? Does alcohol only exist with two levels of its effect? No, the more you drink, the drunker you get. Why not create a factorial design that actually takes into account that the continued consumption of alcohol continues to change your behavior? Alcohol does not work dichotomously, whereby it's a stark difference between consumption and not. The last design didn't take that into account. Why don't we step it up and take a more nuanced level at the consumption of alcohol by having more levels reflecting more conditions of alcohol consumption? So, whereas the previous 2x2 split both our IVs into two conditions, right? So, alcohol versus non, insult versus non. If we were to transform this into a 2x3 to create a more nuanced look at levels of alcohol consumption, what we would do is we could keep insult the way it is, right? The 2 that stands for insult remains a 2, indicating that that factor still has two levels. The fact that the factor standing in for alcohol is now a 3 communicates that there's now 3 levels to your alcohol condition. So an easy way to create 3 conditions within the alcohol IV is to just create different alcohol levels. No alcohol versus 1 drink versus 2 drinks. This allows you to evaluate in a slightly more nuanced way whether more drinks equals more aggression. So again, think about why 2x3 creates this different design. The factorial notation, I will reiterate, the number of numbers stands for how many factors you have. So in a 2x3, there's two numbers. This is before you even read and interpret what the numbers themselves are. The fact that there's two values in that notation means that there's two IVs. So the same as with the 2x2, a 2x3 has two independent variables. The only thing that has changed is that the IV that the 3 represents now has 3 levels. So that's the key difference. Again, the notation has the number of numbers and the numbers themselves that transmit two distinct pieces of information that are both critical to understanding factorial design. So my new data would look like this. Again, you need a full combination of both your factors. Like I mentioned, you can get the overall number of cells by multiplying together the numbers in your notation. So 2 times 3 is 6. This is how that breaks down. I now have 6 overall cells. For all my people who are insulted, I need to have some representation in all 3 of those drink conditions. Likewise, for the no insult group, I need to have some people in all of those conditions. Now, those numbers in this presentation of data, it doesn't stand for the number of people in the conditions. Don't get confused about that. As with the last visual I showed you, that's going to be the means in each of those groups. Ideally, a good research design would have me randomly assigning all of my participants into these 6 groups. Now, as you can imagine, since I have to get representation from more of these groups, factorial designs are going to involve a lot more participants. So the more complicated you get, the more logistical issues you'll run into. So again, think about it. If you get into this slightly more complicated design, it does have the payoff of letting you investigate more complicated hypotheses, but imagine just how many participants you would need to randomly assign people such that there were enough in all of those 6 groups. So these designs, they get unwieldy and logistically difficult pretty quickly. So this would be what that data looks like if I were to visualize it as a bar chart like I did previously. Again, I have a mean for now all 6 of my conditions. This is going to let me evaluate the slightly more nuanced hypothesis of whether aggression continues to be exacerbated as one drinks. So the idea is, does alcohol have this sort of light switch effect on aggression where you have a drink and all of a sudden you're flying off the handle? Or is it the case that the more you drink, the more reckless you get? So this would be the basic story that this data would tell you. Again, you would be able to evaluate main effects. So by collapsing the drink conditions, such that you just have the insult group and the no insult group, right? It still appears evident that insulted individuals are more aggressive before taking alcohol into account. So that's the main effect of insults. The interaction, on the other hand, is that as one continues to drink, the relationship between insult and aggression is exacerbated. As you can see, the highest bar here is the group representing individuals who are insulted and had 2 drinks. Okay, so again, think about how the factorial design breaks down such that it would look like this. And again, think about how you could use that visual to tell a story about main effects and interactions. Okay, so this is the basic way you use your factorial notation system. You can have any number of IVs and however many levels in any of your IVs that you want. So this can contain more than 2 IVs, or this can have more than 2 levels per IV. For example, if I wanted to transform this same 2x3 design into a 4x2, I could just make 4 alcohol conditions, right? A no alcohol group, a 1 drink group, a 2 drink group, and a 3 drink group. If that doesn't seem necessary, if you think the 3 levels of alcohol cuts it, right? You don't need to make it more complicated than minimally necessary to properly evaluate your hypothesis. But if you wanted to have 4 levels to alcohol, you can do that. It would be a 4x2 design. A 2x2x2. Think about how this is different from all the other notations I've shown you thus far. There are 3 numbers in a 2x2x2. Again, think about what that means in terms of reading the notation. There are 3 numbers contained in that notation. There's the first number, the second number, and the third number. What that means is that there's 3 IVs, each containing 2 levels. So again, I will reiterate, because this is a little bit hard to wrap your head around, that properly reading the notation will involve you counting how many numbers there are in the notation, and then actually reading the numbers themselves, because those are 2 distinct pieces of information transmitted in the notation. So any number of IVs is possible. Any number of levels per IV are possible. Again, this can get out of hand real quick because the more complicated your design, the more complicated and logistically taxing your analysis and actually pulling off the research will be. But sky's the limit, party hard. A few more things I want to note in talking about factorial design, so you basically have all the understanding you need to think through your own examples. Experiments traditionally are going to be comprised of variables that the researchers actively change, right? So in the examples that I've been using, I've been saying that we manipulated alcohol, right? This would involve me giving my participants alcohol. I'm actively changing something about that variable to look for causal effects. So experiments traditionally should be constituted of manipulated factors, at least one variable being manipulated. But experimental designs can have pre existing or measured factors. That's completely fine. For example, you might be interested in how gender moderates the relationship between insult and aggression, right? Gender is not something that you can manipulate or change as a researcher. This is something that exists within the individual. So, this is something that you can only measure, you can't manipulate. That doesn't mean that it can't be plugged into your factorial design. If, let's say, you are interested in the relationship between gender and insult on aggression, you would just think through what the levels for the gender variable are, right? Some of your participants will be female, some of them will be male, some of them will be insulted, and some of them would be not insulted. So this is a perfectly legitimate factorial design. The approach will be the same. I need to create the full combination of my factors. I can still look at main effects and interactions. For example, maybe I find that men, before insult is considered, are more aggressive than women, indicating a main effect of gender. But what you have to make sure to do is keep in mind that that factor was measured and not manipulated. So you can't say that gender caused aggression. It might be something else, some other third variable that goes along with gender that was more proximally impacting level of aggression. So you don't want to say that gender causes an effect because you can't know. Because as a researcher, you can't manipulate that variable, you can only measure it. But beyond that caveat, your actual interpretation and analysis would be the same, right? You would break down your means in your four different cells. Gender is just standing in for another independent variable, and you can again look for main effects and interactions. So, main effect of insult or main effect of gender, you can evaluate both of those. Critically, though, moderation would likely be indicated by one of those bars being very, very different from all the others. So the fact that the men who are insulted bar is far higher than all the others, that might tell you that there's a interaction whereby gender moderates the impact of insults on aggression. Okay, let's say I combine everything that I've mentioned so far into one experimental design. So a 2 by 2 by 2 example. Let's think through what that would look like, right? Again, read the notation by first looking at the number of numbers. So in a 2 by 2 by 2, you have 3 IVs, and each IV is going to have 2 levels. So if I put everything I've mentioned as an IV together, right, I'm interested in alcohol and insult and gender. All right, that's 3 IVs, each with 2 levels within them. So think about what would result from this more complicated design. Again, the number of cells you can quickly figure out by multiplying together all the numbers in the notation. So 2 times 2 times 2 is 8. And the reason there's 8 is you can see that you need to fully combine all possible levels of all of your IVs. So I need to have some men who are insulted and had alcohol. I need to have female who are insulted and had alcohol. I need to have men who are not insulted and had alcohol, women who are not insulted and had alcohol, and then do the same thing for no alcohol. That's why it ends up with 8. So this can get crazy real fast, right? Basically, the fact that you can create these more advanced factorial designs is great because you can evaluate more complicated hypotheses. So it's valuable to be able to know what this factorial system looks like and think through how you could create more complicated designs. I will say, though, that it's important to keep in mind that you don't need to make things overly complicated. You want to start simple. You want to start with the bare minimum of independent variables and only make things more complicated as necessary. Because, again, the more complicated designs, think about how many participants I would need to fully fill out a sufficient sample size for a design that's complicated. And also, the analysis is just more of a pain in the ass to do. So, it's interesting to think through how you can make these more complex factorial designs. And being able to read factorial notation is a valuable skill. But again, think through which variables are the most important and only incorporate those. All right, so I'm going to pause there and pick back up to talk through the actual two-way ANOVA computation.